So earlier, I showed you how to grow shapes with mark making and just using the brush pen to make shapes of solid tone. And we also showed how to fill shapes of color and charge in color variation with watercolor on top of your drawings. So in this lesson, we're going to do direct watercolor. I'll show how to pre-visualize interlocking shapes, and I'll do a demo that includes a negative shape, kind of drawing a cutout, and coming back in and drawing fine details with a small brush. So if you remember these, the black and white drawings where we made silhouette shapes, this is really a way that you can work directly in color, and it should be fairly familiar to you if you did your homework and practiced that brush work. Now, drawing directly with the brush and building shapes out of color, it's the same skills. It's almost like we planned it. This kind of drawing is a very fast way, very direct way to get in and just divide the world up into the big basic shapes. When I do this kind of work, I can do it directly in a sketchbook, a multimedia book like this. But sometimes lately I've been just using cut sheets of paper. So earlier, I think on my watercolor demos, I used these cards of material called coroplast. It's a very lightweight plastic, and I just tape sheets of paper to this, and then I can change the type of paper I use. Maybe I want a different surface or different sizes, and bring whatever I want for the day. A good paper for beginners is this stuff called Cancelin's paper called Montval. It's a coated stock. It's not a 100% cotton watercolor paper. It's a synthetic paper, but really great for practicing on, lets you get nice sharp edges. So I'm going to use the Montval for the demo. I've certainly painted a lot on this. Out in the field these days I'm using Arches and Fabriano papers, but really just try a bunch of different watercolor surfaces. So, okay, let's get set up and test one of these shape drawings. So here's my demo for talking about shapes. This is a little scene in an Italian courtyard. I believe this was in Florence. And it's just a really good example of some big bold shapes with an interesting focal point. So I'm going to recreate this. I did do a little bit of a shape first. That's the whole format of the sketch, just that block that has a simple tone in it. And then I'm going to think to myself, how do I make that figure by placing the tree on top? So this is what they call negative drawing. I did a little bit of sketching with the brush and then built that shape directly around the statue. So the guy's form is made by the negative space. And then breaking up into all the other large silhouettes of the various trees and foliage in there. And then the last step is coming back in and adding the small details into that negative shape you left behind. So it's a way of using the big shapes that we would take our single line and go around, but making them with the edge of a wash. Like I said before, you're drawing with the edge of the wash, and everything inside it is wet in wet watercolor. So that's how the shapes interlock. So let's do one and see how it works out. I'm working on a slightly inclined sheet, my cut sheet of paper, stretched, pre-taped out. I have a portable folding easel that I take into the field, or you can just do this on your knees sometimes. And I just like to have a bit of a slant so that the water will flow naturally with gravity. When you draw a shape, it's kind of useful to have the watercolor settle on the page for you. So the first, we're going to talk in greater detail about stacking shapes, but what I'm into these days is giving myself a base tone to work on top of. So let me just get this very first shape in. And there's not much to this because I'm going to quickly get on top of it with my trees. And I'm just trying to make a little scene here, a little vignette. So again, whenever I build a shape, I add color variation as I go. Just looking for opportunities to charge in a few touches of color. Remember how we add a little variation whenever we can? So it's not uniform. It's not like painting a wall. You don't want to end up with too flat a tone. And as long as this thing is wet, I can keep playing with where the edge is. So this appears to be nothing but a square at the moment, but it's the building behind. And as I come down, I know I'm going to get into where the foliage is, where the grass is along the bottom. So I'll just change colors and transition down to the floor here. So that's the first shape, a very abstract square. But I'm imagining in my head, what if I was single lining, I would be making that sketch around the figure, right? So yeah, I should have made that a little bigger when I started. Let's give myself a little bit more height. So as long as that shape is wet, I can continue to manipulate it. And these little random touches, if you remember from when we were washing on top of an ink drawing, they will lighten as they dry. That's the first step. Now, one thing that I had to learn along the way is letting the color dry. So at this point, I would just simply take a bit of a break and leave my sketchbook in the sun and let that settle down. Okay, so it's still a little bit damp. This is what I was talking about with the slant. The water flows to the bottom, so there's still puddles here at the bottom of the washes. But it's dry up here where I want to draw. So the reason I let it dry in between is that I was talking about how you get this wet on dry effect where when you're painting on dry paper, the edge is quite sharp and will hold the washes in. So I have to let this coat dry before I go on top. And then that's the kind of thing I'm going to be talking about in layering in the next one, but it has come up here as well. So the trees, these verticals of these cypress that we see all over Italy are the big bold vertical shapes in this design, and it just cuts around that statue, which I know is in the middle here. So, you know, you saw before about how I did the little dots in pen, so I might do that here. I might do this occasionally just to give myself a little touches, like that's where his head will be, and I'm interested in where his hand should end. The waist of this character, and then he's got kind of his knees up, and there's a little pedestal there. So these little dots may not look like much, but they're helping me visualize it. My little measures, and then I'm going to go right in and build a shape. So let's build the side of this pedestal that he's on. So there's a little bush there. So what you're looking for when shapes touch is how can I draw with the edge? So I want to draw this thing, make this silhouette appear, just like when I was drawing the car earlier in the demo in pen and ink. I want to create my interesting little silhouette shape that has variation inside it. And what I'm doing is drawing with the edge of the shape and doing color variation inside the shape. So those little charges are going to make some interesting colors. I might do the edge pulling a bit, soften an edge, just drop some water on there, and I've made a little bush. And on the other side, just to give myself a little note where that is, a little patch of grass. So already I can see the figure starting to appear, but it's this big tree behind that's going to make the difference. These guys are wonderful that we have these kind of graphic elements, these cedar trees, or sorry, cypress. So I'm thinking what I'd be doing, I'm looking at my own sketch to draw this, but of course the original was done in the sun, sitting in the courtyard, this cloister of a old monastery type situation. So you know, it's the experience of the heat and the warmth in Italy, and the tourists around you. I'm remembering all that was happening while I was drawing. So see, when I built that edge a little bit with the brush, and now I'm just coming away from that shape while it's still wet. I'm building in the mass of this tree. And the beauty of this kind of stuff, I always love the beauty of the watercolor, that it makes all its own shapes kind of free of my thinking. So I'm just trying to build the silhouette, leaving out everything. It's like Michelangelo, he says. He takes away all the marble and leaves behind what is the figure. So if I was working in a sketchbook like those ones from Brazil, where you're going very directly onto the white paper, it's just a stylistic choice, whether you would cut straight in or whether you have a base color. It suited me here in Italy to have that base tone, but you can see it's the same idea. And okay, tricky bit here, where's the wrist? So I'm drawing this arm by leaving everything out around it, and the hand comes out. So it's convenient that I have this composition where the tree is entirely behind this character. I mean, I'm sure that our monks originally planted the trees to get that effect. So there's that silhouette shape appearing, and it's very wet. I use lots of water, it's juicy, so I can still work with the edge, charge some things in. It should be very familiar to us because of the way we were drawing with the brush marker. And some people like to work in color as well. You can get water brushes, load them with colored ink, and do this kind of silhouette color drawing with almost pens. You can almost work in collage like this. And any type of painting is suitable to thinking in terms of silhouettes. So I'm going to leave behind that shape until this is now totally dry. I've made that negative space, but there are other things going on in the scene, so let's put in another one of these shapes, and this I can be much more free with. There's another tree on this side. And I just want to, it's always like making masses and leaving interesting transitions to the edges of those masses. Just like I did with all the little mark making with pen and ink. I don't know if you remember back to that exercise. I'm thinking about making a mass and then what kind of fun stuff is going on the edges of that shape. There's another tree on the other side, and I'm varying up my greens. So this green is slightly darker, bluer, more of a evergreen color. And here I might get more of a teal going for this one. So the sense that I'm in a courtyard with these rows of trees around begins to appear. One shape at a time. And I'll build in some of the sense that there's a ground here. It's a garden, right? So there's always little potted plants and things. And here's an opportunity to really play around with some color. I'll just get some, as if there were flowers in some of these plants. Pulling that out, growing that shape, pulling it in an interesting direction. So see how that works? Very similar to my pen and ink. There are more shapes in here. There's some details on the house in the back, and of course there's what's going on inside the guy. So let me just tune him up a little bit, and before I pause, I want to be able to see where his feet land on the statue. Get a little bit of cast shadow into this tree back here. Because this is still a little bit damp, and I'm fairly confident that it'll blend in a bit. As long as the shape is wet, I like to say it's alive. You can still play with it. Once it dries, you really can't go back. So that's why I like to work one shape at a time and see that I'm comfortable with what's happening in the wash before I stop. Always variation, always interesting colors. Just the implication of what's going on in that foliage. Okay, and now I would take a break and let this stage dry, and then I'll come back and punch a few more shapes in, because I want to have a controlled dry edge to dry edge in here. But actually, you know what? This might even be dry enough that I could, let's see what happens. Something I'll do on location is work on more than one sketch at a time. Sometimes I have 2 or 3 sketches going. And then I can work on one while the other is drying. So that was put myself a reservoir of paint down there. Don't know if you noticed, and then pulled it out. Remember the edge pulling? So what I'm building in here is the cutouts that form these pillars in the background. So by getting to that while this was still a little bit wet, then I can make maybe a blur on the edge. So yeah, I should have waited till dry. See how much it's blending? But every little accident gets to be part of the drawing. So this is, sometimes you have to make that decision. Is it time to move on, or judging how wet it is and whether it's time to stop? It gets to be something that you just learn by second nature. And there's a window up here. So I just want to get the very first implication of that shape. Okay, let's let that sit a bit. And then I'll come back in and finish my character. All right, so now I've created these sets of interlocking positive and negative shapes. And it's kind of neat how by putting in this tree, I've drawn the statue at the same time. It's sort of economical that way. So it's useful to have that negative thinking in mind. And now they're just some small details that I can take my time and come back and revisit. And there's really no limit to the number of things you might touch up. So I'm just going to build some of the larger forms. You can get smaller and smaller and smaller and tighter on your drawing. I tend to step down from the larger brush you saw me use to the smallest thing I have. This is about a number 2, and it's a rigger, so it's got particularly long hair. I kind of like that because it lets me do finer lines. I just feel a little more dexterous drawing with it. So there's like a little subtle shadow. Inside that negative shape, I know I can just play around with dividing it up now. Building things like, this is the knee on this guy, and he's got his robes. Always making, all these statues are all these robed characters. They always seem like the wise men of the ages. So I'm just looking for shadow shapes that draw where there are wrinkles in the fabric. And this is where his arm comes down to touch his side. And there's a little shadow under his foot. So it should be this little magic trick of the character appearing inside the space. And even in those little tiny thin lines, now that I've stepped down, I can still, to a smaller brush, I can still charge in color inside these little thin lines. And it'll stay inside the wet shape. It's like the reverse of the pen and ink drawing, that I start in an ink drawing with the single line sketch defining everything. And here I start with the silhouettes, but the thinking is still the same, that you're working towards this gradual payoff where you get to the point where your figure appears. So see, suddenly I'm starting to see the light side and the shadow side of the figure just popping out. And I've been delaying getting to the face. That's kind of that's a tiny little. When you're working in a sketchbook, sometimes you have these little tiny details, like getting a face onto a character like this, where you just have to concentrate, get some little fine marks together, just to imply what's there. Here's a beard. I just want the impression that when I step back from it, I can see what's there. Just thinking about where are the shadow shapes. And of course, it's much easier when you're there looking at the guy. So next time we come back for Craftsy, we'll go on location to Italy. I'm going to indicate where his hand is here. I kind of didn't cut properly around his hand, so I might come back and touch that up. We'll see. Create a little gradation in the shadows whenever possible. A little dark reservoir. That one has dried down, so it's not going to blend in, so I'll do an edge pull on that. So it's the same kind of thing you saw me doing earlier, but on a very small scale. A little tiny edge pull to make the kneecap appear there. Okay, and there are a few other details in the back. I would get to things like the way this roof is one of those tile roofs that are so common in that area. And so they're distinctive. You can tell, you can always see those tile roofs because of the way the edges have that rippled effect. So every shape can be subdivided into slightly smaller shapes. So there's my character appearing. There's lots more that I could do. You know, when I would sit in this landscape, I might, build up the foliage a little bit more, or go in and get panes in the windows. So see how those little details on top just really pop out the three-dimensional form of that thing. It sort of says, what was that negative space? Well, I knew it was gonna, eventually I'd come back and put a little, put in those small details on top. So it stacks together. In the way when you're painting, when you're working over an ink drawing, the drawing does all the work, building all the detail. But when you're working in a watercolor, you can be selective over which details you emphasize. So I think that's what we mean when we say something is painterly. It's more subtle. It's a subtle representation of what's there, not a literal, or not a hard-edged pen drawing. So it's much more of an implication of form. And I can make things like this like I'm doing something like there's a little bit of a design in this base of this thing here. Like maybe there's a little crest on there. And it's all done with implication. Very, very subtle because it's an unimportant minor thing. I could put a little bit of carving on this. Maybe there's a little brickwork on there. So the watercolor allows you to make these subtle transitions. Once you've got your shapes together, once your silhouettes are working together properly and the negatives you've left, you can come back and draw inside. As we get into the next exercise, we're going to do something a little more of a finished painting. So between now and then, for your homework, why don't you try this out? Going back, thinking like you did with the brush pen, and trying some things where you make a shape with just silhouettes, and thinking about draw two things at the same time with the silhouette shape with the negative space inside it. Revisit even some of your old subjects. Other silhouette drawings you've got in your sketchbooks, try copying them in color, and then head out in the field and bring your little watercolor kit and see what you can do. So in our final lesson, I'll come back and do more of a finished work, working in layers again and stacking the shapes, and emphasize how you can work from larger to smaller, lighter to darker. So come back for that. Have fun.